So, the first speaker is Lars Emmelin from Blekinge Institute of Technology, and introduction to the topic, what is MSP and what is not. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was told that I had 15 to 20 minutes, so I will now speak about 30% faster, and I've taken away all the interesting and controversial slides. What is and what is not? Well, it's ein Mädchen für alles, really. So it could be, the answer could be very conditional, but I will try to talk on these two questions. First of all, what is the rationale for MSP? Well, two groups of perceptions of the maritime problem are quite clearly perceivable. It's an environmental and resource use problem, or it's a primary problem of institutional fragmentation of management of the seas. The call for MSP, to my mind, arises certainly within Sweden, within the environmental and natural resource management, and not from the planning community. The regulations, however, are very often transposed from spatial planning on land, terrestrial spatial planning. That creates one of the problems here. And we need to relate MSP to two different planning philosophies in the European Union. There is, on the one hand, a sort of total planning. All territories should be planned, Raumordnung, Aménagement du territoire, or a Northern European ad hoc problem-solving approach. And these are, of course, rather different. There are also two very different paradigms of environmental governance. On the one hand, an environmentalist paradigm, and on the other, a sort of planning paradigm. I'll come back in a second to that. I will focus on what I see as the most challenging and most interesting and also most problematic, which is the ecosystem approach, which all the rhetoric says that we should apply. The positive thing is the functional approach to time and space. Planning on land is based on a cadastral system, on systems of property. And this, of course, precludes a lot of functional approaches to time and space. There is the uncertainty, the application of the precautionary principle. We tend to talk about the precautionary principle, but if you think about it, where is it applied? Well, in chemicals regulation and pharmaceuticals, and that's about it. The presumption of planning is development and change, not precaution. Strategic planning, the precautionary principle in planning, at least on land, to our experience, has been difficult to uphold in courts. The presumption is on development and change. And strategic planning, to quote Clausewitz, is in the tension between daring and deliberating, zwischen Wegen und Wagen. Then we have the problematic rhetoric. Everybody should be involved. We should have the most suited use of resources, the most appropriate use of resources, but who decides that? And then we have a methodological problem, the uncertain and aggregated data. It should be flexible and adaptive. First of all, let's look at all involved. EU directives and planning rhetoric seems to say and seems to assume that if just everybody has their say, then everything will be fine. And there's very often little reflection on the relationship between participation and the representative democracy. I mean, obviously, all involved means that all those who are present can be involved. Those who are not born or not present can hardly be involved. And that is basically one of our planning theoretical problems. We have sort of a cozy notion of consensus, but the role of planning is conflict resolution. And conflict resolution does not necessarily result in very precise consensus. We very often resolve conflicts by making imprecise statements. We can all agree on sustainable development. Anybody who doesn't agree on sustainable development? But we all have our different interpretation of what it means. And there are fundamental conflicts of interest. For instance, within the environmental field, very often that is forgotten. For instance, between traffic and protected areas. If you have to take another route, you will release more pollutants. We need principles of resolution at the program phase for MSP. And that is precisely what we are not getting in most of the legislation. We are getting generalities like sustainable development, blue growth, and so on. Very often, it seems to me that there is a confusion between consultation, participation, and decision-making. Very often in planning theory, there is a vague notion of planning which doesn't say, is it planning or is it decision-making? And there is a risk of creating unrealistic expectations for stakeholder interests because of this confusion. There is the question of open deliberation, but how open are the deliberations actually? There are classified or proprietary information, and there's also something which we call tactical behavior, stakeholder tactical behavior. We've seen two cases in wind power in Sweden, both by the Swedish Air Force and by the Swedish Navy, of clearly tactical behavior. Well, you might expect Navy and Air Force to be tactical, but... So, to my mind, stakeholder participation is not the panacea that EU documents and ecosystem approach paints it. It's much more complex and much more full of internal inconsistencies. Planning for the most appropriate use, fine, sounds wonderful, but defined by whom and how, by what criteria? Well, the ecosystem approach tells us we should put priority on ecological function and ecosystem services. But quantifying and identifying ecosystem services is, as you know, a great problem and very much dependent on the assumptions you make. The price that you put on it is not a market price paid in a marketplace, but an aggregate of, or a house of cards, of assumptions. For instance, if you look at wave power, should we plan for wave power where the wave height or wavelength is highest, or should other planning factors like location, access, conflicts, political national priorities? If you think about solar power on land, I mean, Germany is not the place where I would start planning for solar power in Europe, but that is where they actually are planning and doing a lot about solar power for all these other reasons than the appropriate use or the appropriate resource. Planners, at least on land, according to what we see in planning theory, tend to want to overlook political and economic bargaining power, which is precisely what is behind much of the definition of most appropriate use. We have the problem of planning under uncertainty. We tend to plan for the known demands and conflicts, which means that we are backing into the future. Very much so with the Swedish national planning that we tried in the 70s, and where, just as it had been decided, a new use came up, which could have been foreseen, but wasn't. So what are the future demands and technologies? How do we plan for those? The ecosystem dynamics and population shifts are obviously confounding factors that the ecologists tell us about. And then we have all the et ceteras. Strategic planning should, if we look at the textbooks, simultaneously create redundancy, which is what economists hate. Oops, because the sea is hitting back. Redundancy is inefficiency to economists. Planning to retain options that we don't know about. But on the other hand, stability for other actors. Because if our planning is not stable, other actors cannot relate to it. So we need to organize what I don't see organized at the moment, what the engineers call technical foresight, but it has to be on technologies, environment, and social developments. And we need to have adaptive management and learning systems that are at the same time reasonably stable. Uncertain data on uses and states. You probably remember this, the known unknowns. We have a number of known unknowns. Development of deep water wind power is such. We know that there is likely to be something, but what it is going to look like is less, and what, where and how. Wave power is another one. Development of the pollution situation is also, it's very difficult to plan if you plan as if the goals will be reached. On the other hand, it's very difficult for a state agency to say our national goals will not be reached, therefore we are planning for a different future. Scenario planning is one approach to it. And then we have the problem of aggregation of data. Data needs to be aggregated because otherwise the situation is too complex to plan for. And I will just show you one example here, the so-called integrated classification status of the Baltic Sea. The classification is based on a measured concentration of large number of chemicals, and it's related to target values for pollution. The problem is that it adds chemicals with completely different problems. It's not just bananas and apples and pears, because they're all fruit. It depends on the weighing of these. How do you weigh incompatible things together? There are no uncertainty measures. And the data, and there are thousands of data, come from various laboratories. So it's not just a question that was talked about earlier, the consistency for individual chemicals. This is called a holistic approach, but the aggregation obscures rather than integrates. And one example is the yellow up in the Gulf of Bothnia here. There is actually a high risk to top consumers of herring here because of slow growth in certain of these chemicals, even though it looks reasonable here. And this critique is by an expert, not by me. So this may be problematic as a common problem perception. SEA is required for MSP. The experience of SEA from comprehensive plans on land is various, but it is problematic. We have an avoidance syndrome. Planners don't see the utility of SEA. It's very often made late and pro forma. Environmentalists, on the other hand, seem to see any change as negative, but of course planning is about change. The problem of the precautionary principle will come in here very clearly. And the attempt to predict from aggregate information. So my view on SEA is that it should identify environmental conflicts, give guidance to lower levels, but the question is, do the decision makers want to know? Sorry, what was the time, did you say?
30 seconds left.
30 seconds left, right. Of course, my reckoning, I have 8 minutes. So, is it just terrestrial planning extended into the sea? Well, I have a quotation here, which we don't have time for, but basically it says that participation is taken in an inappropriate mode from land. So, rounding off, we need to talk not only about the desirable, but also about the possible. We need a pragmatic MSP doctrine. A politically governed program phase, adequate information and aggregation to the level of uncertainty. True three-dimensional. And we need time-set development restrictions, not just say, here we will have restrictions, but we need time-set, just as this has been done in environmental policy. It needs to be harmonized, of course, with permit processes also. Adequate and realistic procedures for participation, which I don't really see around at the moment. The answer is not simple extension of terrestrial planning. Constructive interplay of maritime policy and management. So MSP is not a blueprint or a precise picture of the future, and it's urgent. Thank you for your attention. And then I have another 8 minutes. Okay.
We were just thinking with Angela, would you object too much to join the panel?
Would the panel object too much?
Would the panel object?